This is one of the most advanced satellite control centers in the world. It channels information securely and instantaneously from anywhere to anywhere on the planet. It might be intelligence on an enemy's whereabouts or the authority to open fire. Throughout military history, the difference between winning and losing a battle has frequently been the ability to deliver the message faster or more accurately than the enemy. That is the job of the Royal Corps of Signals, and the key to its success rests with the professionalism, courage and determination of the signallers who have served and continue to serve in the Corps, rather than the technical equipment that they use. But this is how it began. The first signallers did the job on foot. A few thousand years ago, an army could win the day by having the best athletes. What hasn't changed is the need to be first with the message, to be swift and sure, or, in the motto of the Royal Signals, Certa, Cito. The most famous foot messenger was Phidippides. 2,500 years ago, he's said to have run 150 miles in 2 days to request help from the Spartans when an invading Persian army landed at Marathon in Greece. He then ran the 26 miles back to Athens to report the victory that followed and inspired the race we know today. Having delivered his message, he died from exhaustion. Smoke signals have also been used since the beginning of time. With a chain of them, you can cover large distances much faster than a runner. Beacons have the added advantage that you deploy them at night. Sound was used too, with drums and trumpets, or even just soldiers shouting from hilltop to hilltop. Semaphore and heliograph meant you could transmit more complex information, but the drawback of all these methods is that they were insecure and needed groups of people who couldn't be too far apart. The big breakthrough came with the application of electricity to communications. Using batteries and electromagnets, it was possible to send an electrical pulse down a cable, and the electric telegraph was born. In 1838, Samuel Morse invented the Morse code, enabling the pulses to be transmitted as language. The first military use of the telegraph was in the Crimean War in 1854. The key objective of the war was to remove the Russian army from the port of Sebastopol, which the British and French armies succeeded in doing after massive loss of life on both sides. The war is best known for the work of Florence Nightingale and the charge of the Light Brigade, but among its lesser-known heroes are the sappers, who laid 21 miles of cable for a circuit of telegraph offices, digging the channels with spades because the ground was too hard for a plough. They were the direct ancestors of the Royal Signals. New technology also enabled an underwater cable to be laid 340 miles across the Black Sea, from where it joined up with existing telegraph connections all the way back to London. For the first time, London was directly linked to the army overseas. Another lesson learnt was that the army needed communications specialists. In 1870, the Royal Engineers created Sea Telegraph Troop, a team of 2 officers and 133 men. In 1884, this became the first division of the Telegraph Battalion RE. Major Beresford, commander of the battalion's 2nd Division, saw to it that the Roman god Mercury became their emblem. The inspiration came from a statue in the Major's garden that became known as Jimmy, though nobody knows why. The numbers grew rapidly. 2,500 men of the Telegraph Battalion served in the Second Boer War in South Africa, which began in 1899. It was fought against the Afrikaners, settlers of mainly Dutch origin, who were determined to resist British rule. Boer is the Afrikaans word for farmer, and they weren't about to give up easily. It cost the army more lives than any conflict since the wars against Napoleon, but it also brought new milestones in communications technology. In 1876, Alexander Bell registered a patent for an improvement in telegraphy, which eventually led to the development of the telephone. In 1895, Marconi sent the first radio signal and made his first public demonstration of wireless telegraphy a year after that, in 1896. Radio was not successful in South Africa, but telephone had a major impact. When the town of Ladysmith came under siege from the Boers, General French used a telephone line hooked up from the town's telephone exchange to a balloon to direct artillery fire, providing vital resistance until relief forces arrived. Telegraph continued to play a major role. The battalion laid 18,000 miles of telegraph and telephone cable, including elevated open wire, which was known as the airline system. It was sheer, hard slog, often in temperatures over 100 degrees. The payback was the most advanced military signaling network the world had ever seen. The speed of electrical communications was leaping forward. On one occasion, a Wheatstone automatic telegraph sent 6,000 words in 105 minutes, which was more than 3 times faster than anything previously. And in the 4 years of war, over 13 million messages were sent. But for forward control to the front line, the army was still dependent on visual communications, which reached their peak in this war. The heliograph, with its 10-inch mirror, could be seen for up to 100 miles, and a skilled operator could send up to 12 words a minute. As in the Crimea, the telegraph kept the news on the front pages. For many at home, it was an extremely unpopular war, which, despite the final victory, left Britain deeply divided. In 1907, the Royal Engineers Signal Service was formed to provide all electrical signalling for the British Army. And in 1912, the service was also made responsible for all other forms of signalling, including lamps, flags, heliograph, and dispatch riders. In just a few decades, signalling had become a respected and essential part of war fighting, partly through advances in technology, but also through the courage, strength, skills, and determination of signallers. But for what was about to come, they would need even more. In June 1914, in Sarajevo, a Serbian assassin murdered the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Archduke Ferdinand. The incident sparked the biggest conflict the world had ever known. It seems strange now that when war was declared, there was celebration on the streets. Even stranger that most people believed it would all be over in a few weeks. But as reality set in, so did disillusionment. In Europe, the war became a static slugging match, costing thousands of lives for every few yards won or lost. For signallers, trench warfare posed another new technical challenge. By 1916, the telephone was by far the most important means of passing information in the forward areas. As well as voice communication, the telephone buzzer was used to send Morse code messages. New field switchboards meant that the trenches could be networked to each other and back to field headquarters, enabling operations to be coordinated down the 500 miles of the Western Front. It was an amazing technical achievement. But it also meant that the cables had to be laid through the trenches themselves, 6 feet deep, to protect them from shell fire. Today you can see paintings of this in the headquarters officers' mess. The risk of enemy fire made it one of the most dangerous tasks you could do, short of going over the top. But without it, the commanders would not have had a fraction of the communications capacity. Another problem was that both sides introduced overhearing equipment, the beginning of electronic warfare. For the British Army, the problem was solved by Captain Fuller of the Royal Engineers, who invented the Fuller phone. It made the signal more secure by using a much weaker electrical current. As with all new technologies, there were problems, and radio failed again to make an early impact on the Western Front. The opposing armies were in such close proximity that it was easy to overhear the messages. But the message had to get through, and it was here that dispatch riders came into their own and were vital to the eventual victory. Motorbikes were still a new invention. They were rough and hard to control, and the signallers who rode them had to be tough and determined, working on their own in difficult and dangerous conditions. The pressures of the war meant that signallers were always looking for alternative ways of getting the message through. Animals were pressed into service as never before. Carrier pigeons were sometimes the only way of getting messages from the front to the headquarters or from behind enemy lines. Dogs were trained to carry messages between trenches. They also laid cables, as did horses and mules. The war was also a milestone for women in the military. The First Aid Nursing Yeomanry was created in 1907 as a first aid link between frontline fighting units and the field hospitals, as it is to this day. Their work was principally restricted to nursing and admin. However, by 1917, the Women's Auxiliary Army Service was formed, and they now played a much wider role. Many of them worked in signals, processing the ever-increasing flow of information to and from the fronts. As the conflict spread beyond Europe, so did the ever-expanding signal service. At the beginning of the war, there were 6,000 signals. By the end, there were 70,000. Of those, thousands gave their lives. It was now finally recognized that the Army needed a corps of communications specialists. The Corps of Signals was established on the 28th of June 1920, and the royal title was conferred by King George V on the 5th of August. The Royal Corps of Signals had proudly joined the order of battle of the British Army. Boy soldiers training as signal mechanics, operators and trumpeters were transferred to the Royal Corps of Signals and became known as Jimmy's apprentices. They joined the army at 14 or 15 years of age for trade training.
In boys' service, I was trained as a radio operator and what they called an operator wireless and line. Every boy in my time was trained as an operator wireless and line. After that, you were then assessed for other trade if you wanted it, and I became a mechanic, a telegraph mechanic.
The Royal Corps of Signals was based in Maresfield Park, East Sussex, before moving to Catterick in 1925 and to its present home at Blandford Camp. The 20s and 30s were to prove one of the most turbulent periods of human history, and the Corps would find itself again and again in the thick of the action. After World War I, Britain was a different country. It was out with the old and in with the new. Amidst the party atmosphere, there was a widespread belief that such a dreadful war couldn't possibly ever happen again. It's beyond belief now, and it was beyond belief then. For 2 weeks in August 1936, Adolf Hitler's Nazi dictatorship camouflaged its true intentions. A monstrous tyranny to enslave mankind was in the making. These Olympic Games were a showcase set to bedazzle the world into believing that Nazi Germany was peaceful and tolerant. For the First World War was meant to be the war to end all wars, and the British nation were not prepared for another. One result of the revulsion against war was a drastic cut in army spending, which would have a profound effect a few years later. But in the meantime, the sense of security and optimism prevailed. The Royal Signals formed a spectacular display team with bikes and horses to entertain VIPs and the public on special occasions. They went on to become the world-famous White Helmets. And despite the cuts, the Corps continued to grow. 1/3 of them were serving in India. In 1935, they were heavily involved in the rescue operation after a major earthquake in Certa, managing to establish the only communications link with the outside world. In the same year, Princess Mary became Colonel-in-Chief. It was also during the 30s that the Corps became motorized. Radio technology was advancing too. The wireless set number 1 was the first of a new range of vehicle-mounted wireless systems. For the first time, messages could be sent whilst on the move, using voice or Morse code. But it wasn't enough for what came next.
And that consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
When World War II broke out in 1939, the spending cuts came home to roost. The German army and air force had received massive investment since Hitler came to power. Against this state-of-the-art fighting machine, British forces were hopelessly ill-prepared. The British Expeditionary Force, the majority of which were territorials, deployed mainly using the technology and tactics of the First World War. This was no match for the blitzkrieg tactics used by the Germans. It was obvious that our signallers would face new technological and personal challenges. At the retreat from Dunkirk, it fell once again upon the signals dispatch riders to help save the day, playing a vital role in coordinating the withdrawal of British forces. When France fell, the outlook for Britain looked grave. There was the home front to consider, but also British interests abroad. The Royal Signals had an urgent new task: to upgrade the Army's communication system to deal with mobile warfare across the world. As British and Allied forces steadily took the fight back to the Germans, signallers quickly learned new skills. They played a part in winning the air battle. They communicated with agents behind enemy lines. They were involved in clandestine operations and Allied resistance. They worked alongside the Navy, RAF, and Special Forces. The Special Operations Executive, SOE, carried out clandestine actions including coding and signals work. Female SOE agents were sent into France and trained to use short waveband equipment designed by the Royal Signals. The traditional job went on too, laying telephone cables at breakneck speed in the North African desert and wherever else the army went. Behind enemy lines, a long-range desert group, which was set up by Major Ralph Bagnold, Royal Signals, had an impact out of all proportion to its size. It staged daring reconnaissance patrols in the desert behind enemy lines. From the intelligence gained, the Allied commanders were able to plan attacks on enemy installations by the SAS, RAF, and artillery. Signallers were at the heart of reporting the information gained over secure radio links and also confusing the enemy by broadcasting false traffic. The new number 11 wireless set proved a dependable workhorse. Because it could be operated remotely at up to 400 meters, it was a difficult target for the enemy to find and hit. Bagnold also perfected the sun compass, which was not affected by magnetic forces and so could be fixed directly onto the bonnet of a vehicle. The worst environment was in the jungles of the Far East. The Japanese army had invaded Burma and was threatening to move on India. One of the hardest battles was for Kohima, near the Indian border. The Japanese were strongly entrenched in positions high up in the town. For 18 days in 1944, signallers with the 2nd Dorsets engaged in hand-to-hand fighting, suffering heavy casualties, until finally clearing them from their bunkers. It was a key turning point in the struggle to drive the Japanese army out of Burma, and the signals unit was awarded Kohima as a battle honour.
That really was the end of the Japanese in Burma, because after that we started offensives and pushed them slowly but surely back across Burma until we'd got them all.
Other signallers risked their lives in different ways. While a prisoner on the notorious Burma Railway, Lieutenant Tom Douglas built an illicit receiver that enabled the POWs to follow the progress of the war. He also kept a secret list of service personnel who died within the Japanese POW camp. If the guards had found either, he'd have been executed. Behind the scenes, signals expertise was used by the Y service to record secret enemy Enigma-coded messages and then pass them quickly to the UK for decoding. Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire was the spearhead of this work. Other Royal Signals units simulated the radio traffic of whole army groups to deceive the enemy into committing assets where they didn't need them. Even after D-Day, the Germans kept large forces near Calais because they were convinced the Allies would invade there. By the time Royal Signals landed on D-Day in 1944, the Corps was ready to provide the highly mobile and robust communications that the Allied commanders required for the land battle that would lead to Germany. Their equipment was cutting edge now. The new number 10 wireless set used radar techniques to beam 8 telephone lines between land links over any obstacle, and was an early forerunner of area communication systems. As well as providing major support in the fast-moving campaign across France, the Royal Signals were building on their knowledge to develop communications as a major battle-winning tool. There were acts of extraordinary bravery. At the Caen Canal Bridge in Normandy, a line-laying team was wounded by enemy fire. Corporal Waters, Royal Signals, a radio operator by trade, recognized the desperate situation and carried one of his wounded comrades to safety. He then maintained line communications between the Parachute Battalion and Brigade HQ single-handed under fire all day. For his outstanding bravery and professionalism, he was awarded the Military Medal. On an island off the coast of Yugoslavia, signalman Kenneth Smith of the Long Range Desert Group was blown up when he courageously saved the lives of a family by carrying a bomb out of the house where his radio detachment was located. For his utter selflessness and bravery, he was posthumously awarded the George Cross. The victory was won. Over 4,000 signallers had sacrificed their lives. In the process, the Corps had been transformed into the best military communications force in the world. This was Berlin in 1945, a mass of rubble and hungry people. And here it is today, a thriving modern city. It's a miraculous transformation. But Berlin could have been destroyed twice over as a result of the new confrontation of superpowers that followed World War II. The Cold War split Germany and Europe down the middle. To the east of the so-called Iron Curtain was Communist Russia and the countries previously occupied by the Germans. To the west were Britain and the other countries that would eventually join up with America in NATO. The divided city of Berlin was the flashpoint. Here the Iron Curtain took the form of a wall built by the communist government to stop its citizens fleeing to the west. Many tried and were killed. If a war had broken out between East and West, Berlin would almost certainly have been the first place to go. The stakes were high. Both sides were nuclear armed. But in conventional forces, the Communist East had the upper hand. If they couldn't be contained, the West's only option was to go nuclear.
What Royal Signals had to be able to do was to provide the cohesion with which they could operate under. And quite a lot of our early days was trying to get the communications infrastructure out of headquarters.
It was up to the British Army and its allies, with their numerically smaller forces, to make sure this wouldn't happen. And they had a long frontier to protect. But in the area of communications, the Royal Signals provided a significant advantage. Larkspur, which was introduced into service in 1966, they had a mobile tactical radio family that covered the entire battlefield. It enabled communications on the move wherever the battle flowed. Bruin, which was introduced into service in 1968, they had a remarkable secure mobile telephone exchange that was housed in vehicles and not buildings. It moved freely around the battlefield, giving telephone, telegraph, facsimile, and data to mobile and fixed headquarters, and even linking back to the United Kingdom static systems. Not even the General Post Office in Great Britain, the forerunner of BT, could do that at this time. Clansman, which was introduced into service in 1976 and was a successor to Larkspur, was the first family of Army radios deployed in the world to do away with valves and use the solid-state technology of transistors. It was a major advance in military communications, as it gave the commanders access to secure speech and data across the battlefield on the move. The Russians simply couldn't match this at the time, nor, for that matter, could the Americans. The advantage it created was further extended by the introduction of the ptarmigan system in 1985. It was a similar story with electronic warfare. Across Western Germany, Royal Signals experts carried out operations to locate and monitor Warsaw Pact communications with great success. With the introduction of Wavell, they pulled even further ahead, as this was the first battlefield computer designed to give the commander accurate and up-to-date information on his fighting forces and logistic support. Wavell also underlined the commander's dependence on the reliable data communications provided by his signallers. The standoff in Europe was only one aspect of the Cold War era. Way back in 1950 in Korea, the British Army was part of a UN force that fought to a draw against communist forces backed by Russia and China. Many of our soldiers who served between 1947 and 1960 were national service conscripts. The signal's finest moment was with the Gloucesters at the Imjin River, where they held off 3 divisions of the Chinese army for 3 days, effectively saving their brigade from defeat. The Royal Signal's rear link detachment maintained communications with Brigade HQ until the bitter end, only destroying their equipment when the Chinese forces were almost upon them. In Malaya, the army fought and won a guerrilla war against communist insurgents in the jungle. Queen's Gurkha Signals, who had been formed in 1954, played a vital role in winning this tough jungle war. Throughout this period, signallers were also providing vital strategic telegraph communications to many bases around the world as conflict after conflict unfolded. Some a direct consequence of the Cold War, others with roots going back much further in time. In all of them, the Royal Signals gave the British Army an edge that helped ensure it was never defeated in action. The Cold War itself ended in 1989, when the citizens of Berlin tore down the wall while the Guards looked on. To have reached this point without all-out conflict was an extraordinary achievement for which the British Army can take considerable credit, in particular the Royal Signals, who were always in their war role even when on exercise. But if anyone thought this would automatically lead to quieter times, they were wrong. Well before the end of the Cold War, Northern Ireland was proving to be the bitterest and most dangerous operation the Army had faced in peacetime. The challenge of working in an urban environment against a sophisticated and often invisible enemy was new. It required fresh thinking and considerable courage. Specialist skills were once again needed, and Royal Signals were at the forefront of developing military communications technology to defeat the terrorists. One of the best innovations was the heli-tele, a helicopter-mounted eye in the sky. It enabled our forces to stay at a safe distance and observe potential threats and targets. This saved many lives, as well as helping to catch terrorists. Northern Ireland also saw the first use of closed-circuit TV, Again, Royal Signals providing extra eyes to watch for terrorist activity. You see it everywhere now, but it began here. The Royal Signals has consistently provided the second largest contingent in Northern Ireland after the infantry. And through the many years of operations, they have gained valuable experience that they've been able to apply in other urban scenarios. The expertise gained in defeating remote control improvised explosive devices on the streets of Belfast has saved the lives of soldiers in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. The Falklands War was very different. Here the enemy was a visible military force, but thousands of miles away, and with no convenient neighbouring territory from which to launch an attack. Signallers serving with the SAS were among the first in before the task force landed, relaying back information for commanders to plan their strategy. As the invasion got underway, the Corps provided tactical communication on the ground, but also used satellite links to take in intelligence and communicate back to London, which was the first time this had been done in conflict.
I think the Falklands War proved that our combat radio was effective for the task, but needed replacing in certain aspects. It proved the value of satellite communications, both in the Special Forces manned portable sense and in the more strategic equipment that I had down there. And it proved the need to have linkages between all the various service elements. So if you like, it was perhaps one of the key and major drivers towards joint communications.
You're listening to Today on Radio 4 on Thursday, the 17th of January. The Gulf War has begun. 5.5 months after Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United States and its allies have hit back, pounding both countries with bombs in the early hours of this morning. This was the sound of conflict in Baghdad at around midnight our time.
The next major conflict was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which led to the first Gulf War in 1990. Over 1,800 signallers deployed to the desert and were presented with more challenges to the Corps' adaptability. The communications equipment was not designed for the desert environment or the distances involved and had to be modified. It was due to the ingenuity of Royal Signals engineers that the Ptarmigan area communication system, which had been in service since 1985, was linked on a worldwide basis using satellite communications. Little did we know that we would return to this desert in just over a decade. Meanwhile, the unpredictability of the post-Cold War era continued, with a variety of ethnic, religious and nationalistic conflicts around the globe. The Corps was in the thick of every one of them. And so, back to Iraq. There had been a huge advance in information and communications technology during the 10-year gap. This was the start of the computer war era and the demand for instant information. Once again, Royal Signals rose to the challenge.
We have a brain and we have muscles. And the connection between what the brain wills the body to do and those muscles is, of course, the nervous system. In the field army, the brain is the command structure, the muscles are the soldiers at the cutting edge, and it's our communications which replicate that nervous system and send the message from the brain to the muscle. And the speedier that can be done, the more we shall be able to prevail. In the context of our communications, of course, this is where the Corps of Royal Signals provide the field army with that ability to communicate. I've never been failed to be impressed with the professionalism, the determination to get those communications through, and indeed, dare I say it, a degree of lateral thinking. When not everything goes their way, they'll work around it. And so I very much commend the Royal Signals as an essential part of the Army.
The Corps today remains at the top of its profession. The key to this is the quality and thoroughness of its training. From the early days at Maresfield, through the times at Catterick, to the Royal School of Signals and its integration into the Defence College of CIS at Blandford Camp, the ambition for technological leadership has been paramount. Many of the civilian instructors and support staff are ex-Royal Signals themselves and share the passion to uphold the Corps' standards of excellence. Today, that passion continues at all levels, from initial technical training to degree level. The acquisition of knowledge is the foundation of the Royal Signal's strength. But technology is evolving faster all the time, month by month almost. Being able to adapt and learn is now more important than at any time in the past. Though training is not all about technology. Adventurous training is there to develop confidence and self-esteem, and to have fun. Over the years, these expeditions have taken signallers to the far corners of the Earth, giving young signallers an extraordinary variety of experiences. Sport is there for the same reasons. Members of the Corps are encouraged to compete at the highest level, and several have represented their country. The Corps is also a family that people can remain members of for the rest of their lives. It's an international family, which has brought together people from all over the world. The Royal Signals Association is the organization that keeps the members together. It has branches in every part of the country and organizes the annual Family Day at Blandford. It also has a welfare section that helps past or present signallers and their loved ones if they suffer need, hardship, or distress. Wherever people go after they leave the Corps, and however many years pass by, they will always have a place here if they want it. The current Colonel-in-Chief is the Princess Royal, who has held the post since 1977. She is a true friend of the Corps, giving much of her time to represent its interests and support its wider activities. The Master of Signals is a senior retired officer who symbolizes all serving signallers, and through the Royal Signals Association represents the retired members of the Corps. The Colonel's Commandant assists the Master of Signals in his duties. Those activities reach out far into the life of the country. In the Territorial Army, there are approximately 5,000 signallers who are playing an increasingly active role serving alongside regulars on operations around the world. There are also nearly 300 signal platoons in the cadet forces in schools and universities. All advanced cadet signalling courses are run at the Royal School of Signals. Many of these cadets go on to become regulars or TA. The White Helmets continue to astonish huge crowds of all ages with their amazing displays of skill and nerve. At Blandford Camp, the Royal Signals Museum provides not only a rich storehouse of Royal Signals history, its unique collection of communications technology is a major educational resource in its own right for schools and colleges. And the Royal Signals Band has achieved a worldwide reputation playing classical, dance and jazz, as well as traditional marching music. The Corps Quick March, based on the traditional airs Begone Dull Care and Newcastle, dates from 1926. The band is progressive and forward-looking, and yet retains its high standards and traditions. Most important of all, the Royal Signals is a family that expects much of its members. It has impressive ancestors, proud achievements, and the highest standards of conduct and performance. It's for each new generation to uphold those standards as the next chapters of this history unfold. Military communications have evolved to an astonishing level of sophistication since the days of smoke signals and barefoot messengers. And since the digital age began, the pace of change has been breathtaking. But one thing no one can do any better than previous generations is predict what lies around the next corner. The only certainty is that the best preparation will still be the ability to adapt and learn. The necessity to control communications on the battlefield is the very reason for the existence of the Royal Corps of Signals. And so it shall remain. Certa, Cito. Swift and sure.